Hello and welcome. My name is Zafar Iqbal and you are watching the Mojo Story. Prime Minister Modi begins his 2 day visit to France. There you can see his flight has landed in France and he's reached France. Many important defense agreements are in the pipeline on the cards. India is likely to ink an agreement to buy 26 Rafale jets. He will attend the Bastille Military Day Parade during his visit. Indian contingents from three services will also participate in the visit. So, there he is, Prime Minister Modi has arrived in France. This visit comes just a month after Prime Minister Modi had an important visit in the US where he met with President Biden, and now he is in France. And defense cooperation is the focus in this visit, but there are other agreements also expected. We're joined by Peter Klepe, is the editor-in-chief of Brussels Report. He joins us on the Mojo Story. Welcome to the show, Peter. How significant do you think this visit is? Prime Minister Modi going to France, where he will be having important meetings are already scheduled.
I think it's an important meeting, not so much because of a number of cooperation initiatives or even because of the sort of, let's say, more intense defense cooperation that's being announced, but because I think that we're entering a more pivotal moment where the fallout of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is leading to a world where China and Russia are getting closer together, and where Western powers and their allies are seeking greater rapprochement to India in particular. India, which is the most populous country in the world, a booming economy, and let's say also cultural ties that are not to be underestimated. It's almost, you could say, the real bridge between Asia and Europe, together maybe with Turkey. So I think because of that, we see Western powers, not just France but also the United States, looking at India in a much more interested manner than was the case before the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Right, and that's a very important point. But the Western powers have a different sort of a perception as far as war in Ukraine is concerned than India. It may necessarily not be the same, but the Western powers are still keen to strengthen relationship with India. We saw Prime Minister Modi first going to America, and now he's visiting France. So clearly, the Western democracies seem to strengthen the relationship with India, even though there may be not a complete convergence of perception as well, perspective and an approach as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned.
Well, yes. So there are great, let's say, difference of opinion, but at the same time, great convergences. So India has traditionally been, let's say, more friendly to Russia than Western powers.
Yeah.
But and of course, there's the cooperation in the BRICS, the BRICS context. But I think at the end of the day, a great geostrategic rival for India is China. And if we are moving to bloc politics, which I do not think is in itself a good thing, I think it's rather unfortunate, but it's a reality. Then I can say also for India's geostrategical interests, closer cooperation with the West is ultimately in its interest, because if you look at the growth prospects for China on the long term, China has made an impressive run. It's been a fantastic thing that China has opened up to the world. So many people lifted out of poverty, so much economic growth and benefits that not only Chinese people but also the rest of the world has enjoyed. but they have a massive problem of aging. I mean, just like the West, but the difference is that especially the United States is attracting a lot of immigration. It's still the dynamic sector in technology. Look at artificial intelligence, for example, and yeah, therefore I think if India would have to choose, which is never a good thing, then it's more natural to side with the Western bloc.
Of any bloc right from the non-alignment movement. India has never chosen a bloc. Will India
Yes.
choose a bloc? Because even now, when the war in Ukraine is unfolding, India never took a clear one-sided stand. So that has not been the case with India ever. But even though that is a clear stated position of India, the Western powers still seem to be reaching out to India. And do you think eventually that could not be, that could, India cannot sustain that and they would have to tilt towards some side in the end?
Look, as I mentioned, I don't like the block thinking, but it's sort of where we are moving. Even Switzerland, the most neutral country in the world,
Yeah.
has faced enormous pressure to cooperate with the sanctions against Russia. The sanctions that are, I think, very dysfunctional. They're not working. The arms support to Ukraine, that's working. But nevertheless, the pressure on Switzerland has been very big, and Switzerland has made certain concessions to a certain degree. It has given up its neutrality. Also, Sweden, which has been neutral, I think, for 200 years, has just been allowed to join NATO after the Turkish president Erdogan has given up his opposition. So again, block thinking is dangerous. It's not good. It's better to trade. It's if we trade, there's a much lower chance that there will be conflict. This is not perfect, of course, as we've seen. There's been many occasions where countries that trade with each other nevertheless went to war, but it will reduce the chance on conflict. Now, if you have a bloc emerging, if you have China siding with Russia, which it is doing. I mean, China is claiming to be neutral, but in fact, they are, they have the ability to control Russia, to stop the aggression, and they don't lift even a finger. So I think China is choosing to go for the bloc approach, and I think we have to try to be as diplomatic as possible. I think we have to be very careful not to end up with it in a direct confrontation with Russia, but at the same time, we cannot allow Russia to just violate the borders of a sovereign country, and it's therefore justified, to at least provide it with the means to defend itself, while trying to make sure that we do not end up in a war with Russia, and while trying to, of course, explore all the opportunities for diplomacy. So indeed, I think in that sense, India, with its history, as you say, of non-alignment, it probably has a lot to teach to the world, um, because in the West we have our own hawks. Look at the invasion of Iraq, even of Afghanistan, a terrible disaster, a complete failure on all fronts. And yeah, so I think in itself it would be great to have closer ties with India, not just economically, but also in military terms, because also the Indo-Pacific region is only going to grow in importance. There's fantastic opportunities there, beautiful things happening, and yeah, it would be good for Western economies to be more integrated. Also, I think with that region.
Yes, and you talked about China factor. India has its own problems with China in eastern Ladakh. There has been a confrontation at the borders, a standoff uh, for some time now. But specifically about this visit, do you think it's both a mix of substance and symbolism? Indian contingents taking part in the military parade, but at the same time, there's possibility that India would ink uh, a deal as far as Rafale jets is concerned.
Well, yeah. So what we see is that India is updating its military equipment, and some of its older military equipment is Russian. I think it's quite telling that it's now going for French equipment. That there are joint production projects,
Yeah,
as you said,
yeah,
fighter jets, submarines, if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken.
yeah,
Very high profile. This is also good for France because, as you remember, France has suffered the AUKUS debacle, where the United States and
yeah.
Australia suddenly decided to move forward without France. So, of course, apart from the geostrategy, there's a lot of economic interest always at play with these big military projects. But indeed, I think it looks quite material. It's not a coincidence that France is so closely involved because France has always been among the Western powers one of India's best friends. At the end of the 80s, France, as one of the only powers, did not impose sanctions on India for developing nuclear capacity. So yeah, there's a great history of French Indian relations. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the military cooperation with France is so intense now.
You also spoke about the submarine, the three Scorpene class submarines that India would be building, and there is also a focus on that deal during this meeting, and that is to boost the Indian capability to face any aggression from its neighbors, particularly China.
Yeah, so well, we all know the tensions in the South China Sea. Let's not forget that France also has a military base in Réunion in the Indian Ocean, almost close to Madagascar. So also for France, in strategic terms, it's important to safeguard the right to use international waters freely. This is a cornerstone of international law. It's hundreds of years old, and it's important to not only have this as some kind of a legal agreement, but also to be able to police it if necessary. We see that China is disputing this, and that's what the tensions in the South China Sea are all about. So therefore, indeed, to have this military capability at the high seas is of crucial importance for everybody involved in the region. India, France, United States, others, even Germany has recently decided to test China, to fare through the South China Sea, and you cannot accuse Germany, which is so pacifist these days, of being an aggressive power. Germany is generally concerned about international cooperation, and I think even China should understand it's in their interest. It's not in the interest of China to see the international order break down. China is highly dependent of globalization, and therefore I think it should understand that it should not side with these kind of Russian imperialists failing projects. It should not try to double guess the right of international passage on the international waters, something which it is doing. But yeah, we can only hope and plead for China to adopt this kind of thinking. But at the end of the day, if it needs to be, you need to be armed to the teeth. You need to be military capable to enforce these kinds of arrangements, and therefore we need military equipment. And that's also, I think, what the war in Ukraine has shown. In Europe, especially the Benelux, Germany, Sweden, these are very irresponsible countries when it comes to neglecting defense capacity. Thankfully, not everybody in Europe has been so negligent. The United Kingdom, France, Finland, they have been much more responsible. But in any case, now everybody in Europe is aware that defense has been neglected, that we need to change tack, and yeah, that we need a strong military and a strong defense.
This relationship to a different level, to a different zone. This relationship between two countries has withstood a nuclear test. When in 1998 India conducted a nuclear test, France was the only country that did not impose sanctions on India.
Yes, exactly. Also, because back then in the 80s and before, I think France was annoyed by international criticism of its own nuclear tests all the time.
Yeah.
So this was, of course, part of the story. But also traditionally, I think France sees it as important to have a capable India in the region. It's also a democracy, India. That's also something that I think we should not underestimate. Of course, there are problems. The European Parliament has been criticizing India. It's a very big country with many different ethnicities and religious minorities and majorities. So of course, not everything is perfect. But at the end of the day, this is a country where the leadership can change through democratic means. And that is fundamentally something that makes India, apart from the language, of course, or the common language, English, much closer to the West in cultural terms than China. That does not mean that we should not try to have good relations with China. We should try to have as good relations with everybody as possible. But I do think it makes, making sure that we are at a good stance even more important, I think.
Yeah, we'll talk about the EU Parliament slamming the Indian government. But before that, there's a lot of emphasis on the defense deals between the two countries. But there are areas of mutual understanding, like in technology, science, cultural, and economic, as has been pointed out by the Indian side. So it's not just narrowly focused on defense deals and Rafale jets and submarines only.
Yes, but let's be honest, that's still the most important focus
Yeah, yeah,
of cooperation. At the end of the day, this is about geostrategy. It's about business also.
yeah.
Yeah, like I think that's always gonna take the forefront.
Mm.
But yes, the cultural on the longer term, the cultural ties. I mean, we speak of the Indo-European language family, for example. There are deep cultural ties between the Indian subcontinent and the European continent, and I think that's something we should never forget. Certainly not when we are moving into a world where Asia is becoming every day more important, not just because of the great population, but also because of the fact that you have so many Indian powers now that are performing fantastically in economic terms. No longer only Korea and Japan, but also Indonesia, Singapore, of course, and many others. So I think that's really something that has changed quite a lot as compared to, let's say, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, that we have, yes, a booming Indo-Pacific region. This is also the reason why the United Kingdom recently managed to accede to the CPTPP, the Great Trans-Pacific Trade Deal. It's maybe economically mostly symbolic, or at least not the most important aspect for the United Kingdom, but in geostrategic terms, also apart from France, of course, the United Kingdom is the other great military power in Europe, and it is very keen to keep close ties to the region, and also actually India in particular.
And there is a natural alignment because both India and France are democratic countries in the end. Uh,
Yes.
that is also an important factor. But in the end, I would want to ask you about as Prime Minister Modi lands in France, there is this European Union resolution about the situation in Manipur. The European Parliament has slammed the BJP, what it calls a nationalistic rhetoric, and India has says that it's an internal matter. European Union discussing Manipur and coming out with a scathing criticism of the Indian government. Manipur is a there has been tension in Manipur, and there have been clashes between two communities over the last few days.
Yes, exactly. So this particular resolution is coming from the European Parliament, which has a habit of expressing its opinion about which has a habit of expressing its opinion about all kinds of things all across the world. I mean, often it is saying the right things, but let's say it is not bound by the diplomatic norms that governments adhere
Yeah.
to. So you could say that the European Parliament has no influence over foreign policy, and therefore it should be seen more as some kind of an NGO. Now, I don't think it's in itself bad that you have European Parliament resolutions about all kinds of things, but sometimes it can complicate diplomacy because foreign governments do not always realize that the European Parliament is only a glorified NGO when it comes to foreign policy. Now, to the heart of the matter, I looked into it a little bit, and apparently it's clashes between Hindus and Christians. Correct me if I'm wrong. In my experience, it's always very tricky to have, let's say, a radical opinion about these kind of tensions. Often the tensions go very, very deep or very complex. Often, most people involved are, of course, not happy with it. Um, so I think it's important to to be a little bit modest when expressing an opinion about that. I mean, even in Europe, when we look at the Balkans, we have a history of very profound cultural tensions between the different groups. And I'm sure that we understand much better what's going on there than what we understand about the tensions in India or in other places in the world. And even in the Balkans, as Europeans, with all our good intentions, we have struggled to improve the situation there. In my view, it's dangerous to try to pick sides, to try to intervene. I think often it's good to, if you have this deep-seated tribal hatred, it's often to test, like in places like Israel or in the Balkans, to try to stabilize the situation. Like, for example, as applied to the Balkans, it's dangerous to try to change borders because even if it makes sense in one case, for example, you could say, "Oh, why shouldn't the Serbians that live in Albania not be allowed to go to back to Serbia when the Serbians that live in Albania, when they should not, why they should not be allowed to go to Serbia?" In itself, that makes sense. But when you do that, then you may open a whole can of worms in the region. So I think just trying to freeze a conflict, trying to keep stability is always very important. So I don't know what the BGP has precisely said. If they have inflamed the rhetoric, any politician, there's always a temptation to engage into this, to make grand statements, to rally the base. Then of course this makes the solution harder. So that's my 50 cents on this. It's better to try to calm down the situation and not inflame the rhetoric. And ultimately, when the economy improves, because of course there's always an economic side to all of that, and everybody is doing better in material terms, then typically you have a higher chance. It's not guaranteed that also ethnic tensions, that also ethnic tensions are appeased.
Peter Klepe, editor in chief of Brussels Report, Thanks so much for joining us today on the Mojo Story. That's all we have on today's show. Thanks for watching.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.